Hello everybody, I'm Eternal Flame here, and today I'm here to have a discussion about Yuji and Yuji awakening his domain expansion, or if Yuji is going to awaken a domain expansion at all. Now for a long time, I actually haven't had this discussion, even though I'm kind of one of the big JJK Theory channels for Yuji type theories and that type of good jazz about Yuji's power-up, but the reason I haven't talked about that for a long while is because I didn't actually know what would even be a possible domain expansion for him, or if he could even possibly awaken a domain expansion to begin with. So through this video, I want to talk about a couple things. One, if it is possible for Yuji to even awaken a domain expansion up to this point with everything established, because spoilers, it is now very possible for him to awaken a domain expansion, which I'm going to get into later into the video. Two, if he should narratively awaken a domain, which the narrative reason is going to be very different than the logical reason, which is why I'm separating into a different part. And three, what his domain sure hit would even be if he has a domain and if he has a sure hit for the domain. And like what I would prefer it to be. So without further ado, let's just get straight into this video. We're going to first start out with the entire explanation of should Yuji be able to use a domain based on what has been established for him up until this point. Now before the most recent chapter, I would have said no. I felt that it would have been very, very unlikely that in the time span of a month, even with how many training gains that Yuji had made over that month-long time skip, I don't think it would have been likely for him to be able to pick up the necessary barrier skills in order to awaken a domain. Now my opinion changed a little bit after seeing Yuji land a total of 7 black flashes and him unlocking that much and massive of his potential, but even then I didn't think that was enough until what was established by Kusakabe in the last chapter. As Kusakabe himself says, if you do certain movements over and over again, whether it be in sports or whatever, it'll become muscle memory. Sukuna created his technique in your body, which means your body remembers using extreme special grade jujutsu. You can thank him for your exceptionally quick understanding and growth. So not just does Yuji remember how to use curse energy excellently through the 2 times Sukuna has taken control over him and manipulated the massive abundance of curse energy that Sukuna has, which led to Yuji's immense growth in curse energy control alongside Yuji's own innate potential, but also this should help significantly in Yuji learning a domain expansion and how to utilize a domain, purely because of the fact that his body will remember utilizing Sukuna's domain 2 separate times. Because remember, Sukuna has used his domain 2 times in the past. He used it once against the Finger Bearer, and he used it once against Mahoraga. Furthermore, stacked on top of this, he would also already have knowledge on barriers, mainly because of the fact he has mastered Simple Domain, which Simple Domain is very much a barrier technique that also has a sure hit property to it. It just does not have a technique imbued into it, so it is not a true domain expansion. In other words, Yuji already has barrier knowledge which he can utilize with a domain, as well as the knowledge that's already engraved into his body on how to use a domain. Now I don't think Yuji can immediately awaken a domain, but if he ends up landing more black flashes or gets more and more pushed by Sukuna, I feel like he can do something similar to what Mahito did, where Mahito on the verge of death was actually able to awaken his own domain. So if Yuji gets onto the verge of death, he might end up awakening his own domain in the future. So it could be very, very possible with everything that has been established. Now, I have seen some people say that in order to awaken a domain expansion, you need to fully master your own curse technique. However, that is very, very much not true. After all, a domain expansion is a completely different set of skills in comparison to your own curse technique that aren't really too linked. The ability to use domain expansion is dependent on your knowledge of barriers as well as your ability to create your own domain expansion. Furthermore, we also have 2 examples of people who haven't fully mastered their curse technique despite being able to awaken their own domain expansions, with those 2 examples being Megumi Fushiguro and Mahito. This is true especially for Mahito because the longer he continues, the more and more he masters his own curse technique and he continues to live on. Yet, when he awakened his domain expansion when he was fighting against Nanami and Yuji, he had not fully mastered his curse technique and was still finding out new things about it on the fly, which very heavily proves that it's not about how masterful you are of your own curse technique, but how masterful you are over barrier techniques. But considering the fact that he has Kusakabe's level of Simple Domain hammered into him by Kusakabe, as well as Sukuna's level of Open Barrier Domain skill, all engraved into his body even before he had landed 7 black flashes which each amplified his potential even more, as well as Sukuna's own potential ingrained into his body as stated by Urame that Yuji should have equal potential to that of Sukuna, it seems very possible that Yuji would be able to awaken a domain expansion. However, an Open Barrier Domain I'm not as sure about. It should also be noted, while I do think it's fully possible for Yuji to awaken a domain expansion and that the tools have all been set up for Yuji, I think it will take him a bit more time before he can awaken a domain expansion, considering he's just getting adjusted to using Cleave right now, let alone the fact he hasn't even used Dismantle yet. So if Yuji does end up awakening a domain, it is likely not going to be for a long while. Like, I can see it being a couple chapters in the future, not even a couple, like maybe 6 chapters into the future or 7 chapters until Yuji uses a domain, considering the tools have all been set up for Yuji to use a domain, at least on a mechanical type of front. Now I'm going to talk about the narrative side on whether Yuji should awaken a domain narratively or not. Which the narrative is even more important than a mechanical type of front. After all, a lot of things can technically happen mechanically all the time, especially within the world of Jujutsu Kaisen, that just don't happen because of the narrative itself and the narrative that it's trying to portray. And there are 2 main narrative points around Yuji against him getting a domain, with one of them being much stronger than the other one in my opinion. Which those 2 narrative points that at least I can think of are what a domain symbolizes and how that very much goes against Yuji's character, or at least what we believe to go against Yuji's character, which I'm going to explain a little bit more in a second. And the second point is going to be the narrative between Yuji and Megumi, and how the power-up of a domain should be going to Megumi and not Yuji, which I believe is actually much more of a stronger point, which I'm going to go into after I talk about the symbolism behind a domain. To understand the symbolism behind a domain and why it's important, you have to understand what a domain represents. What a domain represents is the absolute peak of selfishness. After all, the reason why I believe that a domain represents the absolute peak of selfishness, and this is a common take that I have at least seen on the internet, is because of the fact that a domain is bringing people into a world that the user themselves commands, one that overrides any other desires and forces an opponent to get hit by the domain as a result of that. Where domains are usually awakened through selfish desire and focusing on oneself in that moment and being so enveloped with themselves. As we see this through Megumi, Mahito, and finally Higuruma, all in their respective moments for how they awakened a domain expansion. But with domains being the peak of selfishness, why should Yuji awaken one? After all, for a long while, me and several people have believed that Yuji just represents selflessness. However, I don't believe that is the case, and I don't actually think that would end up preventing someone from awakening the domain to begin with. After all, Yuta Akotsu, someone who is an incredibly selfless person who doesn't even care about himself whatsoever, actually is able to awaken a domain himself, in a pretty potent domain. So being selfless isn't really an issue. And even further, Yuji's not exactly selfless either. Now, I go a lot more in depth with this with another video I did recently about how Yuji and Sukuna were almost the same. However, Yuji's selfishness spawns in his ability to forsake his own body and do anything so long as the mission itself is complete. He will gain any amount of power no matter what risk is placed on himself, so long as it is to complete whatever mission is set in front of him, with his current mission being, of course, to rescue Megumi from Sukuna. And Yuji's selfishness is so potent and strong that his ideal to save Megumi and kill Sukuna is as strong as Sukuna's own ideals themselves, as Sukuna says that Yuji is the only one to be able to rival him on ideals. So because of the fact that Yuji is able to rival Sukuna on ideals, it would make a lot of sense narratively for him to awaken a domain in the final battle against Sukuna. After all, his peak of selfishness against Sukuna's own peak of selfishness, which is why if Yuji were likely to awaken a domain, it would likely be to clash domains with Sukuna if it does end up happening in the future, which I'm kind of 50-50 on whether it would happen or not. But it actually is much more narratively fitting than what people give it credit for what a domain is supposed to represent. As well as Yuji awakening a domain, because he very much fits within the stereotype of what someone needs to do in order to awaken a domain, and even if he wasn't an incredibly selfish person, which Yuji is an incredibly selfish person, it's similar to how Yuta Akotsu is also able to awaken a domain. However, there is a second reason why I don't think it is likely for Yuji to awaken a domain expansion, and that actually centers around another character named Megumi Fushiguro. Now, if Megumi ends up getting saved and actually does nothing in the final battle against Sukuna and just ends up getting saved and Sukuna is put down through that way, then this is completely invalid, and it's likely Yuji's going to awaken his own domain expansion as a result of that. This premise is very much based around if Megumi has anything to contribute at all in the final battle against Sukuna. So to understand why Megumi is likely going to be the one who ends up awakening a domain over Yuji, and why that narratively makes a lot more sense, we need to go back in time, back to when Yuji and Nobara fought against Eso and Kechizu, while Megumi fought against the Finger Bearer. While Yuji and Nobara got stronger in that arc through landing black flashes respectively, and the entire point of that arc was more so to catch Nobara and Megumi back up to Yuji, Megumi got his own power-up through that arc, which that power-up that he got was awakening his own domain expansion. The point of awakening his domain expansion was in order to equalize the massive amount of growth Yuji made back in Goodwill, which we see continues to be very, very consistent throughout Shibuya as well, and more importantly in the Culling games, because when Megumi fights against Reggie, he uses an even more evolved version of his domain, as Megumi has two ways of showing that he gets stronger, which is A, through taming more of his Shikigami, and B, and this is the much more important way, awakening and evolving his own domain expansion. However, this continues to be a constant throughout all of Jujutsu Kaisen, at least on Yuji's side, if you look at how Yuji seems to get stronger a majority of the time, other than in chapter 214 and how he got stronger from being freed from Sukuna. Where across Shibuya, when he fought Eso and Kechizu, all of that was because he had landed Black Flashes, and that ended up amping his control over Curse Energy even more. Now, Yuji did get a small power-up against Choso, but that was more just him funneling his negative emotions into Curse Energy, and it wasn't that massive of a power-up in comparison to the massive power-up he gets later on. Even with Yuji being stronger in the culling games than he was in Shibuya, that's because of the fact that Yuji hadn't fully healed yet from his battle against Mahito, which is just straight up saying that Yuji should have been as strong as he was in the culling games in his battle against Mahito if he went in at full HP. So other than in 214, it's been a constant that Yuji gets stronger through landing more and more Black Flashes, other than his power-up in 214, which came from Sukuna being free from his body, which could also be similar for Megumi, and Megumi gets a power-up from Sukuna being free from his body. And because of that and Gege's general narrative type of style showing how Megumi gets stronger in comparison to Yuji, the next step is more than likely either a closed barrier or an open barrier domain expansion. This also makes sense mechanically as well, because while Yuji has felt Sukuna use a domain expansion 2 times in his body, Megumi has felt him use a domain expansion bare minimum 4 times in his body. The reason that I say a bare minimum of 4 times is because we don't know what Sukuna was doing during that month-long time skip, or if Sukuna was practicing his domain expansion at all during that amount of time. So it could be possible he was, it could be possible that he wasn't, but at bare minimum, we do know for a fact Megumi would have felt Sukuna use his domain expansion 4 separate times. So because of the fact that Megumi's narrative path of getting a power-up is awakening his domain expansion, and Yuji's narrative path of getting a power-up is through Black Flashes, I see it being extremely unlikely that Yuji's going to awaken his domain expansion if Megumi comes into the battle against Sukuna. Though it could also be possible that Megumi and Yuji both end up awakening domain expansions, and we finally get what should be the result to a 3-way domain expansion clash that we got teased about so long ago in Sendai Colony. Either that or Gege could just straight up abandon his normal way of showing how Megumi and Yuji get stronger, or he could have Megumi start to use Black Flashes as well and himself get stronger through that type of method, or them both using a domain expansion against Sukuna, with one using it in the Soul type world where Megumi resides in, and Yuji using his own in reality against Sukuna. After all, in my opinion, all of these are very, very possible as well, even though I don't see it being as likely for Yuji to awaken a domain if Megumi ends up coming back into the battle. But now we're going to get into the final part of this video, and this is the a lot more fun part of this video, because even though I don't know how likely it is that Yuji does actually end up awakening a domain in his battle against Sukuna, we're going to now talk about the potential sure hits that Yuji can imbue into his domain, and what I think is the most likely for Yuji to use as a sure hit for his domain expansion. Now, in my opinion, I don't actually see Yuji using Cleave and Dismantle as his sure hit in the domain expansion at all, but that's mainly because of the fact that I don't think they're going to just make an outright copy of Malevolent Shrine. Even though it would likely be possible for Yuji to be able to use it in that way, I doubt that that will be the way that Yuji uses it. What I think is a lot more likely for Yuji to have as a domain sure hit is actually a blood manipulation based sure hit. However, I don't think he's going to use blood manipulation as a sure hit in the similar way to how you might imagine most blood manipulation users just use a sure hit, which is just basically making a domain filled with blood and making the blood constantly hit an opponent, because that doesn't really seem fitting for Yuji as a person to make blood constantly hit an opponent. What I see as being a lot more likely for Yuji is him using his domain expansion in order to manipulate somebody's blood. Basically, as a result of that, the sure hit will force an opponent to stay still and not be able to move, because the domain itself will keep them still while Yuji is able to wail punch after punch onto them. Why? Yuji is still ultimately, no matter what, a punch and kick merchant. Punching and kicking is what comes natural to Yuji, so him having a domain that will allow him to always perfectly land those punches and Black Flashes on an opponent with inside the domain would make it significantly better. Furthermore, it's also a non-lethal domain, which would make it even better in clashes, and just imagine how deadly and dangerous it would be to be stuck inside of a domain where you're not able to move and Yuji is able to constantly punch you and land his soul-shattering Black Flashes on an opponent. This would go even more crazy if my theory about Yuji awakening anti-gravity comes true into the future, and it's actually anti-gravity is what holds an opponent down and not blood manipulation, mainly because I do think that Yuji should do it through anti-gravity instead, mainly to not step on Choso's turf. But no matter what, I do think that Yuji's domain and sure hit will focus around forcing an opponent to be unable to move. However, that's my opinion on whether Yuji should or shouldn't awaken a domain expansion, and I want to hear what you guys think in the comment section down below, whether you guys think Yuji should or shouldn't awaken a domain expansion, and what his sure hit would be if he could end up awakening a domain expansion, or if it should even be in the battle against Sukuna, or should it be like in the end of the series, like the end of the series post-series Yuji, and that type of level of strength in a similar way how Gojo only awakened it after his awakening. Anyway, I'm gonna see y'all later, peace out, have a good day.